Imagine a man who began his life first as a merchant, and only later as a scholar, a trader in fine cloth and silk, who spent his early years in the bustling markets of a great city, buying and selling, building a reputation for honesty so complete that, by the accounts, he would not allow even a small flaw in his goods to go unmentioned to a buyer. Imagine a successful merchant, moderately wealthy, respected for his fairness in trade, who might have lived out his days in the comfortable prosperity of a man of business, and who instead became one of the greatest legal minds in the history of his civilization, the founder of a school of law followed, to this day, by hundreds of millions of people across the world. Imagine a man who took the careful, reasoning mind of the merchant, the mind trained to weigh and measure, to consider every angle of a transaction, to reason from one case to another, and turned it to the study of the law, becoming the master of legal reasoning, the one who, more than any other, developed the methods by which the law could be reasoned out, applied to new situations, extended to cases the texts had never directly addressed. Imagine a man whose legal acumen was so great that he is remembered as the father of jurisprudence, the founder of the discipline of reasoning out the law, whose methods would shape the legal thought of his civilization for more than 1,000 years. Imagine a man so devoted to his principles that, when the rulers of his age sought to make him a judge, to bring him into the service of the state, he refused, again and again, unwilling to compromise his independence, unwilling to be made the instrument of rulers he could not in conscience serve. Imagine a man who paid for this refusal with his freedom, imprisoned for declining the office that was pressed upon him, who endured imprisonment and hardship rather than betray his principles, and who died, by the accounts, in prison, faithful to the end to the independence he would not surrender. This is the story of such a man. His name was Nu'man ibn Thabit, but the world remembers him as Abu Hanifa, and he is honored as one of the greatest jurists in the history of his civilization, the founder of the oldest and most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith, so revered for his legal genius that he came to be called the great Imam. He was born more than 1,300 years ago, in the city of Kufa, in what is now Iraq, into a family of merchants, and he became, from these beginnings in trade, the master of legal reasoning, the father of jurisprudence, whose school of law is followed, to this day, by a great portion of the believers of his faith across the world. We will follow his whole life tonight, slowly and gently, from his birth into a merchant family, his years in the cloth trade, his turning to the study of knowledge, his long apprenticeship under his great teacher, his rise to become the master of legal reasoning and the head of a great circle of learning, his refusal of high office and the imprisonment it brought him, and the close of his devoted life. It is a story about the life of the mind, about the reasoning out of the law, about the founding of a great intellectual tradition, and about the integrity that would not bend even before the power of rulers. And through it all runs a quiet question, gentle and enduring. What does it mean to give one's life to the pursuit of understanding, to reason carefully toward what is right, to hold to one's principles whatever the cost? So settle in, and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world, and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every detail. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old story carry you gently toward sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 1,300 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some quiet moment of your own, something of the satisfaction that filled this man's life, the pleasure of working something out, of reasoning carefully toward an answer, of understanding a difficult matter through patient thought. Most of us know something of this, the quiet satisfaction of the mind at work, of careful reasoning, of understanding reached through patient thought. Abu Hanifa gave his life to this, to the careful reasoning out of the law, to the patient working out of difficult questions, to the life of the disciplined and reasoning mind. There is a quiet pleasure, as the night settles, in keeping company with such a mind, in following its careful reasoning, in resting in the company of one who loved to understand. So as we begin the long walk back through his life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and gentle story unfold at its own unhurried pace, the way the night itself unfolds, slowly and gently, toward the quiet of deep sleep. We will move softly, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the man, we must first understand the world that made him, the city in which he lived, and the intellectual ferment of his age. We must travel back to the early 8th century, to the city of Kufa, in the lands of what is now Iraq, a great city of the early Islamic world, a center of commerce and learning and intellectual activity, where the developing thought of the faith was being worked out in the gatherings of the learned. The city of Kufa was a great city of the early Islamic world, founded in the early years of the faith's expansion as a garrison town, which had grown into a major center of population, commerce, and learning in the lands of southern Iraq. It was a bustling city, full of the energy of trade and commerce, home to a diverse population drawn from many lands, a meeting place of peoples and cultures. And it was, in particular, a great center of the developing intellectual and religious life of the faith, home to many scholars, a place where the thought of the faith was being worked out, where questions of belief and law and practice were studied and debated. Kufa was, in this respect, quite different from the older centers of the faith, like the city of the Prophet, which was the cradle of the faith and the home of its earliest traditions. Kufa was a newer city, a place of cultural mixing and intellectual ferment, where peoples of many backgrounds met and mingled, where the questions of the faith were encountered in new situations and worked out through reasoning and debate. It was a place of intellectual energy and ferment, where the developing thought of the faith was being actively worked out, where the methods of reasoning about the faith were being developed. And this intellectual ferment, this energy of thought and debate, would shape the young Abu Hanifa, drawing him into the life of the mind, providing the setting for his development as a thinker. For Kufa was a center, in particular, of the developing study of the law, the working out of how the principles of the faith should be applied to the practical questions of life. The scholars of Kufa were known for their attention to legal reasoning, to the working out of the law through careful thought, to the application of the principles of the faith to the practical questions that life presented. There was, in Kufa, a tradition of legal reasoning, a developing discipline of working out the law through careful thought, and it was into this tradition that Abu Hanifa would enter, becoming its greatest master, the one who would develop the methods of legal reasoning to their highest point. Let us dwell a while longer on the city of Kufa, where Abu Hanifa lived his life and developed his thought, for it was a remarkable place, and understanding it helps us to see why it was there, of all places, that the great tradition of legal reasoning developed, and why Abu Hanifa's thought took the shape it did. Kufa was, as we have noted, a relatively new city, founded in the early years of the faith's expansion as a garrison town, which had grown rapidly into a great city of commerce and learning. Unlike the older centers of the faith, with their long-established traditions and their settled ways, Kufa was a new city, a place of growth and change, where new arrangements were being worked out, where the life of the faith was being established in fresh circumstances. This newness, this quality of a place where things were being worked out afresh, gave Kufa a particular character, a particular openness to the working out of new questions through reasoning and debate. And Kufa was, above all, a meeting place of peoples and cultures, where men of many backgrounds came together, bringing their different traditions and perspectives, mingling in the commerce and the intellectual life of the great city. There were the Arabs, the original bearers of the faith, and there were the many peoples of the conquered lands who had embraced the faith, the Persians and others, bringing their own cultural heritage. There were people of other faiths as well, living in the diverse city. Kufa was a cosmopolitan place, a meeting of peoples and cultures, where different traditions and perspectives mingled, where the diversity of the great empire was gathered in a single bustling city. This mixing of peoples and cultures gave Kufa an intellectual vitality, an energy of thought and debate, that made it a great center of the developing intellectual life of the faith. For when peoples of different backgrounds and perspectives come together, when different traditions mingle and meet, the result is often an intellectual ferment, a stimulation of thought, a sharpening of ideas through encounter and debate. Kufa, with its mixing of peoples and cultures, had this intellectual vitality, this ferment of thought, that made it a great center of learning and debate, a place where the questions of the faith were actively worked out through reasoning and discussion. And this intellectual vitality expressed itself, in particular, in the developing study of the law, the working out of how the principles of the faith should be applied to the questions of life. For the diverse and changing circumstances of the great city presented many new questions, situations the sources had not directly addressed, problems that required the working out of the law through reasoning. The scholars of Kufa, faced with these new questions, developed the methods of legal reasoning, the working out of the law through careful thought, the extension of its principles to the new situations that the diverse and changing life of the city presented. Kufa became, in this way, a great center of legal reasoning, the home of a developing tradition of working out the law through careful thought. This tradition of legal reasoning that developed in Kufa was distinctive, marked by a particular emphasis on reasoning, on the working out of the law through careful thought, on the use of the reasoning mind to extend the law to new situations. The scholars of Kufa were known for this emphasis on reasoning, this confidence in the use of the mind to work out the law, this development of the methods of legal reasoning. And it was into this tradition, this Kufan emphasis on legal reasoning, that Abu Hanifa entered, becoming its greatest master, the one who would develop its methods to their highest point. His own emphasis on reasoning, his confidence in the use of the mind to work out the law, reflected the tradition of his city, the Kufan emphasis on legal reasoning that he would bring to its fullest development. We can understand, then, why it was in Kufa that Abu Hanifa developed his great tradition of legal reasoning, and why his thought took the shape it did. The city's newness, its quality of a place where things were worked out afresh, its mixing of peoples and cultures, its intellectual vitality, its developing tradition of legal reasoning, all shaped Abu Hanifa and his thought, providing the setting and the tradition within which his genius developed. He was a son of Kufa, shaped by its intellectual vitality and its tradition of legal reasoning, and he became the greatest master of that tradition, the one who brought the Kufan emphasis on reasoning to its fullest and most sophisticated development. So we may see Abu Hanifa against the background of his city, this new and cosmopolitan place, alive with intellectual vitality, home to a developing tradition of legal reasoning. It was a fitting setting for the development of his genius, this city of intellectual ferment and legal reasoning, and his thought bore the marks of its origin, the Kufan emphasis on reasoning, the confidence in the use of the mind to work out the law. The great master of legal reasoning was a son of Kufa, shaped by its intellectual vitality and its tradition of legal reasoning, and his genius brought that tradition to its fullest flowering, making the city of Kufa the home of one of the great legal traditions of his faith. This, then, was the world that made Abu Hanifa, the great city of Kufa, a center of commerce and learning, alive with intellectual ferment, home to a developing tradition of legal reasoning. Into this world a child was born, into a family of merchants, who would grow up amid its commerce and its intellectual energy, who would enter first into its trade and then into its learning, and who would become the greatest master of its tradition of legal reasoning, the father of jurisprudence, the founder of a great school of law. So let us leave the wider world behind now, and turn toward the city of Kufa, and the merchant family into which a child was born who would become the great master of the law. The child who would become Abu Hanifa was born in the city of Kufa, in the lands of what is now Iraq, around the year 699. He was given the name Nu'man, the son of Thabit, and he was born into a family of merchants, traders in fine cloth and silk, who had settled in Kufa and prospered in their trade. The sources differ on the precise origins of his family, some holding them to be of Persian background, others tracing them to Arab roots, but what is certain is that they were merchants, traders in silk and cloth, who had made a place for themselves in the commercial life of the great city. His was a prosperous and religious household, a family of some means, engaged in the trade in fine cloth, devout in their faith. The young Nu'man grew up in this household, amid the commerce of the family trade and the devotion of a religious home. In his youth, by the accounts, he memorized the sacred text, the foundation of a religious education, and he was raised in the practice of his faith, in a household that valued both honest trade and religious devotion. He grew up, then, in a merchant family of some prosperity, devout in faith, learning both the family trade and the practice of his religion. There is a beautiful story told of his father, or of an ancestor, which we may treasure as a tradition expressing the family's character, whatever its precise historical truth. It is said that an ancestor, walking by the river, found an apple that had floated down on the water, and ate it, being hungry. But then he was troubled, wondering to whom the apple had belonged, troubled that he had consumed something that was not his without paying for it. And he sought out the owner of the orchard from which the apple had come, to make it right, to pay for what he had taken. Whatever the precise truth of this story, it expresses the scrupulousness about right and wrong, the care not to take what was not one's own, that the tradition associates with Abu Hanifa's family, the scrupulous honesty that he would himself display in his trade. For the young Nu'man entered, in his youth, into the family trade, becoming himself a merchant, a trader in fine cloth and silk, following the path of his family. He took up the silk trade, buying and selling fine cloth, conducting the business of a merchant in the markets of Kufa, and he established, by the accounts, a reputation for remarkable honesty and fairness in his trade, a scrupulousness about right dealing that became famous. There are many stories of his honesty as a merchant, his fairness in his dealings, his scrupulousness about not taking unfair advantage, which we may treasure as expressions of his character. It is said, for instance, that he once sent a partner to sell some cloth at a distant market and instructed him to point out a flaw in the cloth to any buyer. The partner forgot to mention the flaw, and sold the cloth without disclosing it. When Abu Hanifa learned of this, he was troubled that the buyer had not been told of the flaw, and rather than keep the profit from a sale made without full disclosure, he gave away the entire proceeds in charity, unwilling to profit from a transaction that had not been fully honest. Whatever the precise truth of this story, it expresses the scrupulous honesty of Abu Hanifa as a merchant, his unwillingness to take even a lawful profit, if there were any doubt about the fairness of the transaction, the remarkable integrity that marked his conduct in trade. This scrupulous honesty in his trade reveals something important about Abu Hanifa, something that would mark his whole life, a deep concern for right and wrong, a scrupulousness about doing what was right, an integrity that would not compromise even for the sake of profit or advantage, the careful attention to right dealing that he showed as a merchant, the scrupulousness about fairness and honesty, reflected a deep moral seriousness, a concern for doing right, that would characterize his whole life. The honest merchant, scrupulous about fairness in his trade, was already showing the moral seriousness, the concern for right and wrong, that would mark his later life as a scholar and his refusal to compromise his principles even before the power of rulers. And his years as a merchant gave him something else that would prove important. A practical, reasoning mind, trained in the careful weighing and considering that commerce required. For the merchant must reason carefully, weigh and measure, consider every angle of a transaction, anticipate consequences, reason from one case to another. The mind of the merchant is a practical, reasoning mind, trained in careful consideration, in the weighing of factors, in reasoning toward sound conclusions. And Abu Hanifa, trained in this practical reasoning through his years in trade, would bring this reasoning mind to the study of the law, applying to legal questions the careful, practical reasoning he had developed in commerce. His years as a merchant trained his mind in the careful reasoning that he would later apply, with such genius, to the working out of the law. Let us dwell a while on the world of trade in which Abu Hanifa spent his early years, the world of the merchant, for it shaped him in important ways, and it is a world worth understanding, the world of commerce that produced the great master of the law. Abu Hanifa was, as we have seen, a merchant, a trader in fine cloth and silk, following the trade of his family. The silk trade was a significant commerce in his world, for silk was a precious and valuable commodity, traded across great distances, from the lands of the East where it was produced to the markets of the West where it was sold. The trade in silk and fine cloth connected distant lands, moving precious goods along the great trade routes, and the merchants who conducted this trade were significant figures in the commercial life of the great cities. To be a silk merchant was to be engaged in a significant and valuable commerce, dealing in precious goods, connected to the great networks of trade. The life of such a merchant was a life of commerce, of buying and selling, of the careful conduct of business. The merchant must acquire his goods, assess their quality and value, and sell them at a fair profit, conducting the many transactions of his trade with care and skill. He must deal with many people, negotiate prices, assess the trustworthiness of those he dealt with, manage the risks and uncertainties of commerce. It was a life that required a practical intelligence, a careful judgment, an ability to assess and weigh and reason about the many factors involved in the conduct of trade. The merchant's life was a life of practical reasoning, of careful judgment, of the skilled conduct of business. And it was a life that required, above all, integrity, for the conduct of trade depended on trust, on the honest dealing of the merchant, on his reputation for fair dealing. A merchant known for dishonesty, for cheating his customers, for unfair dealing, would lose the trust on which his trade depended. A merchant known for honesty and fair dealing would gain the trust that made his trade flourish. Integrity was not merely a virtue, but a practical necessity in the conduct of trade, the foundation of the trust on which commerce depended. And Abu Hanifa, as we have seen, was known for his remarkable integrity in trade, his scrupulous honesty, his fair dealing, which gained him a reputation that made his trade flourish. This world of trade shaped Abu Hanifa in important ways, developing in him qualities that would serve him in his later life as a scholar. It developed his practical reasoning, his careful judgment, his ability to weigh and assess and reason about complex matters, the practical intelligence that the conduct of trade required. It developed his integrity, his scrupulous honesty, his concern for fair dealing, the moral seriousness that marked his conduct in trade and would mark his whole life. And it gave him an independence, a means of supporting himself, that would later allow him to pursue his learning and to refuse the office of the rulers without being dependent on their favor. This last point is worth dwelling on, for Abu Hanifa's continued engagement in trade, even after he became a scholar, gave him an independence that proved important, for he did not depend, for his living, on the patronage of the rulers or on the income of an official position. He had his own means, his own trade, his own independent income. And this independence allowed him to pursue his learning freely, to teach and reason out the law according to his conscience, and, crucially, to refuse the office of the rulers without being made destitute by the refusal. His trade gave him an independence that supported his integrity, that allowed him to maintain his principles without being dependent on the favor of the powerful. The merchant's independence supported the scholar's integrity. A fitting, even instructive, quality marks this, in the way that Abu Hanifa's life as a merchant supported his life as an independent scholar of integrity. For his trade gave him not only the practical reasoning and the integrity that served him as a scholar, but the independence that allowed him to maintain his principles, to refuse the office of the rulers, to teach and reason according to his conscience without being dependent on the favor of the powerful. The merchant's life, far from being merely a prelude to his life as a scholar, supported and enabled it, providing the practical reasoning, the integrity, and the independence that made possible his life as an independent master of the law. So we may see Abu Hanifa's years as a merchant not as a mere prelude to his real life as a scholar, but as a formative period that shaped him in important ways and supported his later life. The world of trade developed his practical reasoning, his integrity, and his independence, the qualities that would serve him as a scholar and support his life of principle. The merchant who became the master of the law carried with him, into his life of learning, the practical reasoning, the integrity, and the independence that his years in trade had developed, and these served him well in his life as an independent master of the law, faithful to his principles even before the power of rulers. But Abu Hanifa was not destined to remain a merchant, for the intellectual ferment of Kufa drew him toward the life of the mind, toward the study of knowledge, and a moment came when he turned from a life devoted primarily to trade toward the pursuit of learning. The accounts relate that he was drawn toward knowledge by an encounter with a scholar, who, recognizing the young man's intelligence and aptitude, advised him to devote his talents to the study of the faith, to the pursuit of knowledge, rather than to remain solely in trade. This encounter, by the accounts, was a turning point, awakening in Abu Hanifa the desire to pursue knowledge, to devote his talents to the study of the faith, to enter the life of the mind that the intellectual ferment of Kufa offered. And so Abu Hanifa turned to the pursuit of knowledge, entering the life of learning that the great city of Kufa offered. He began, by the accounts, with the study of theology, the discipline that concerned itself with the questions of belief, the nature of God, the principles of the faith. In his early enthusiasm for knowledge, he was drawn to the theological debates that flourished in Kufa, the discussions of the deep questions of belief, and he devoted himself for a time to this study, becoming skilled in the theological discussions of his age. But in time, by the accounts, Abu Hanifa turned away from theology toward another discipline, the study of the law, the working out of how the principles of the faith should be applied to the practical questions of life. He came to find, it seems, that the endless theological debates, the disputes over the deep questions of belief, were less fruitful, less satisfying, than the practical work of the law, the working out of how the faith should be lived, how its principles should be applied to the concrete questions of life. And so he turned from theology to law, from the abstract debates of belief to the practical discipline of jurisprudence, finding in the law the field that would engage his genius and absorb his life. The turning of Abu Hanifa from theology to law, from the abstract debates of belief to the practical discipline of jurisprudence, is a significant moment in his development, and it deserves our reflection, for it reveals something about the cast of his mind and the nature of the discipline he would master. When Abu Hanifa first turned to the pursuit of knowledge, he was drawn, as we have seen, to theology, the discipline that concerned itself with the deep questions of belief, the nature of God, the principles of the faith. The theological debates of his age were lively and engaging. The disputes over the deep questions of belief that flourished in the intellectual ferment of Kufa And the young Abu Hanifa, in his early enthusiasm for knowledge, was drawn to these debates, becoming skilled in the theological discussions of his age. But in time, by the accounts, Abu Hanifa turned away from theology, finding it seems, less fruitful and less satisfying than he had hoped. For the theological debates, the disputes over the deep questions of belief, often led to endless controversy, to disputes that could not be definitively resolved, to divisions and quarrels among the believers. The deep questions of belief, the nature of God and the principles of the faith, were matters on which the human mind could reason endlessly without reaching definitive conclusions, and the theological debates often led to fruitless controversy and division, rather than to settled understanding. Abu Hanifa, it seems, grew weary of this endless controversy, this fruitless dispute, and turned away from theology toward a more fruitful discipline. And he found this more fruitful discipline in the law, the working out of how the principles of the faith should be applied to the practical questions of life. For the law, unlike theology, concerned itself with practical questions, with the actual conduct of life, with the working out of right action in concrete situations. And these practical questions, unlike the deep questions of belief, could be worked out, reasoned through, brought to practical conclusions that could guide the conduct of life. The law was a practical discipline, concerned with the actual conduct of life, and it offered the satisfaction of working out practical questions, of reaching conclusions that could guide action, that the endless debates of theology did not offer. This turn from theology to law reveals something about the cast of Abu Hanifa's mind, its practical bent, its preference for the working out of concrete questions over the endless debate of abstract ones. His was a practical mind, trained in the practical reasoning of trade, suited to the working out of concrete questions, and it found in the law, the practical discipline of working out right action, the field that suited it best. The practical mind of the merchant, trained in the working out of concrete matters, found its proper field in the law, the practical discipline of reasoning out right action, rather than in the abstract debates of theology. The turn from theology to law was the finding, by a practical mind, of its proper field. There is wisdom, perhaps, in this turn, in the preference for the fruitful working out of practical questions over the endless debate of questions that cannot be definitively resolved. For there is a kind of intellectual labor that is fruitful, that reaches conclusions, that guides action and serves life. And there is a kind that is endless, that leads only to further controversy, that does not reach settled conclusions or serve practical ends. Abu Hanifa, in turning from theology to law, turned from the latter kind of labor toward the former, from the endless debate of unresolvable questions toward the fruitful working out of practical ones. There is wisdom in this preference, this turning toward the fruitful labor that reaches conclusions and serves life, away from the endless debate that does not. We should not understand this as a disdain for theology or the deep questions of belief, for Abu Hanifa remained a man of deep faith, and he did take positions on theological questions when they arose. But his primary devotion, his life's work, was given to the law, the practical discipline of working out right action, rather than to the endless debates of theology. He found his proper field in the law, gave his genius to the working out of practical questions, devoted his life to the fruitful labor of jurisprudence, rather than the endless debate of theology. His turn from theology to law was the finding of his proper field, the field in which his practical genius could do its most fruitful work. So we may see in Abu Hanifa's turn from theology to law a significant moment in his development, the finding by a practical mind of its proper field, the turning toward the fruitful working out of practical questions. It revealed the cast of his mind, its practical bent, its preference for concrete questions over abstract debates, and it directed his genius toward the field in which it would do its greatest work, the law, the practical discipline of reasoning out right action. The practical mind of the merchant found its proper field in the law, and in that field it would achieve the genius that made Abu Hanifa the father of jurisprudence, the master of legal reasoning, the founder of a great school of law. The study of the law, the discipline of jurisprudence, was concerned with the working out of how the principles of the faith should be applied to the practical questions of life, how the sacred sources should guide the conduct of the believers, how the law should be derived from its foundations and applied to the concrete situations that life presented. It was a practical discipline, concerned with the actual conduct of life, the working out of right action in concrete situations, and it engaged the practical, reasoning mind that Abu Hanifa had developed in his years as a merchant. In the law, Abu Hanifa found the field that suited his genius, the practical discipline of reasoning out right action, that would engage his mind and absorb his life. To study the law, Abu Hanifa attached himself to a great teacher, the most renowned jurist of Kufa in his age, a master of the law named Hamad ibn Sulayman. He became the student of this great teacher, attending his circle, learning the law at his feet, absorbing his knowledge and his methods. And he remained the student of this teacher for a long time. By the accounts, some 18 years, a long and devoted apprenticeship in the law, learning from the master, deepening his knowledge, developing his own legal understanding under the teacher's guidance. For 18 years Abu Hanifa studied under his great teacher, a long and patient apprenticeship that laid the foundation of his mastery of the law. The long apprenticeship that Abu Hanifa served under his teacher, the 18 years he devoted to the study of the law at his master's feet, deserves our deeper reflection, for it reveals much about the nature of true learning and the patience that mastery requires. Abu Hanifa attached himself, as we have seen, to the foremost jurist of Kufa, a master of the law named Hamad, becoming his student, learning the law at his feet. And he remained his student for a long time, some 18 years by the accounts, a long and devoted apprenticeship in the law. Let us consider the significance of this long apprenticeship, this devotion of 18 years to learning under a master. 18 years is a long time, a significant portion of a life, to devote to learning under a teacher before taking up the role of a master oneself. Abu Hanifa might have set himself up as a teacher much sooner, might have claimed mastery after a few years of study, as many do. But he did not. He remained a student for 18 years, devoting this long period to learning under his master, deepening his knowledge, perfecting his understanding, before he would take up the role of a teacher himself. This long apprenticeship reflects a patience, a humility, a seriousness about true learning that is worth pondering. For true mastery, the apprenticeship suggests, is not quickly attained, but requires long and patient study, the deep absorption of a discipline over many years. The law was a deep and complex discipline, requiring years of study to truly master, and Abu Hanifa understood this, devoting the long years necessary to attain true mastery, rather than claiming it prematurely. His long apprenticeship reflects his understanding that true mastery requires patience, that the deep learning of a discipline cannot be rushed, that the genuine attainment of expertise requires the devotion of long years to patient study. He was willing to devote these years, to be patient, to attain true mastery rather than claiming it before he had earned it. There is a humility in this long apprenticeship as well, a willingness to remain a student, to learn from a master, rather than hastening to claim the status of a master oneself. Abu Hanifa, for all his genius, was willing to remain a student for 18 years, to learn humbly at the feet of his master, to defer the status of a teacher until he had truly earned it. This humility, this willingness to remain a learner, this deference to his master, reflects a genuine modesty that is striking in one of such great gifts. The future master of the law was content to remain a student for 18 years, humbly learning from his teacher, deferring his own mastery until he had truly earned it. Consider the contrast between this patient, humble apprenticeship and the haste with which many seek to claim expertise and status. For there is often, in human affairs, a haste to claim mastery, to assume the status of an expert, before one has truly earned it through deep and patient study. Abu Hanifa's long apprenticeship stands in contrast to this haste, this premature claiming of expertise, reflecting instead a patience and a humility, a willingness to devote long years to genuine learning before claiming mastery. His example calls us to a similar patience and humility in our own learning, a willingness to devote the years necessary to true mastery, rather than hastening to claim expertise before we have truly earned it. And there is, in this long apprenticeship, a tribute to the value of the teacher, the master from whom Abu Hanifa learned, the importance of learning from those who have gone before. For Abu Hanifa did not work out the law entirely on his own, from nothing, but learned it from his master, building on the knowledge of his teacher, the accumulated learning of the tradition. His genius was not a solitary genius, working in isolation, but a genius that built on the learning of his teacher, the tradition he had absorbed through his long apprenticeship. The value of the teacher, the importance of learning from those who have gone before, is reflected in Abu Hanifa's long and devoted apprenticeship under his master. So we may see in Abu Hanifa's long apprenticeship, his 18 years of study under his master, a reflection of the patience and humility that true mastery requires, and a tribute to the value of learning from those who have gone before. He devoted long years to patient study, remained humbly a student under his master, built his genius on the foundation of his teacher's learning, before taking up the role of a master himself. His long apprenticeship reflects the nature of true learning, the patience and humility it requires, the building on the learning of those who have gone before, and it laid the foundation of the mastery that would make him the father of jurisprudence, the great master of the law. A quiet admiration belongs to this long and patient apprenticeship, this devotion of 18 years to learning the law under a master. Abu Hanifa did not rush to set himself up as a teacher, did not hasten to claim mastery before he had truly attained it, but devoted long years to patient study under his teacher, deepening his knowledge, perfecting his understanding, before he would take up the role of a teacher himself. The long apprenticeship reflects the seriousness with which he approached the law, his unwillingness to claim mastery before he had truly earned it, his patient devotion to the deep learning of his discipline. The future master of the law served a long and patient apprenticeship, laying through years of devoted study the foundation of his later mastery. During these years of study, Abu Hanifa also traveled, by the accounts, to the holy cities and other centers of learning, broadening his knowledge, studying with other scholars, learning from the learned of other places. He made the pilgrimage to the holy cities, and used these journeys to study with the scholars he met, to learn the traditions and the legal knowledge of other centers, to broaden his learning beyond what Kufa alone could offer. He studied, by the accounts, with many teachers, learning the traditions of the Prophet from those who transmitted them, deepening his knowledge of the sources of the law. His learning was not confined to Kufa, but drew on the knowledge of many centers and many teachers, broadening and deepening his mastery of the law and its sources. And then, by the accounts, when his great teacher died, the scholars of Kufa recognized Abu Hanifa as his successor, the new head of the great circle of learning, the foremost jurist of the city. After 18 years of patient study, after deepening his knowledge through travel and study with many teachers, Abu Hanifa had attained such mastery of the law that, when his teacher died, he was recognized as the foremost jurist of Kufa, the successor to his great teacher, the new head of the circle of learning. The long apprenticeship had borne its fruit. The patient years of study had made him a master, and he now took up the role of a teacher and a leading jurist, the foremost master of the law in the great city of Kufa. So Abu Hanifa rose, through his patient study and his developing mastery, to become the foremost jurist of Kufa, the head of a great circle of learning, the master of the law. From the merchant who had turned to the pursuit of knowledge, he had become, through long years of devoted study, the great master of the law, the foremost jurist of his city, recognized for his legal genius, his mastery of the discipline of jurisprudence. The honest merchant had become the master of the law, the trader in cloth the master of legal reasoning, through the long years of patient study and the development of his remarkable legal genius. As the foremost jurist of Kufa, Abu Hanifa presided over a great circle of learning, a gathering of students and scholars who came to study the law under his guidance, and it was in this circle that his greatest work was done, the development of the methods of legal reasoning and the working out of the law that would become his lasting legacy. His teaching circle became one of the most renowned centers of legal learning in the Muslim world, drawing students from far and wide, producing scholars who would carry his methods and his teaching across the centuries. The teaching method of Abu Hanifa's circle was distinctive, and it reflected the reasoning genius that was his great gift. For he did not simply lecture to his students, handing down rulings to be memorized, but engaged them in discussion and debate, working out the law together through reasoning and argument. He would pose legal questions to his circle, and the students would discuss and debate them, considering the various aspects, weighing the arguments, reasoning toward conclusions, with Abu Hanifa guiding the discussion until a well-reasoned conclusion was reached. The law was worked out, in his circle, through collective reasoning and debate, the students and the master together reasoning toward sound conclusions. This method of collective reasoning and debate was a remarkable feature of Abu Hanifa's circle, and it reflected his understanding of the law as something to be reasoned out, worked through by careful thought and argument, rather than simply received and memorized. The law, in his understanding, was not merely a body of rulings to be learned by heart, but a discipline of reasoning, a working out of right action through careful thought. And his teaching method reflected this understanding, engaging his students in the active reasoning out of the law rather than the passive reception of rulings. The collective reasoning of his circle, the working out of the law through discussion and debate, was the method by which his great legal work was accomplished. Let us try, for a moment, to picture the texture of Abu Hanifa's life as a teacher, the lived reality of his circle of learning, for it was here that his greatest work was done, and picturing it helps us to see him more truly, the master amid his students, reasoning out the law. We might imagine the gathering of his circle, the students assembled around the master, in the mosque or the place of learning where they met. There would have been students of many backgrounds and abilities, drawn from far and wide by the fame of the master, gathered to learn the law in his renowned circle. There would have been the master himself, presiding over the gathering, posing questions, guiding the discussion, the center of the circle of learning. And there would have been the lively discussion and debate through which the law was worked out, the students reasoning and arguing, the master guiding, the collective working out of the law through reasoning and debate. The atmosphere of the circle, we may imagine, was one of lively intellectual engagement, of active reasoning and debate, rather than passive reception. For Abu Hanifa's method, as we have seen, was to engage his students in the active working out of the law, the discussion and debate of legal questions, rather than the mere handing down of rulings. The circle would have been alive with discussion, with the posing of questions and the weighing of answers, with argument and counter-argument, with the collective reasoning toward conclusions. It was a place of active intellectual engagement, of lively reasoning and debate, where the law was worked out through the collective thought of the master and his students. We might imagine the kinds of questions that occupied the circle, the legal problems that were posed and worked through. There would have been questions about the practical conduct of life, about the right action in various situations, about the application of the principles of the faith to the concrete questions that life presented. There would have been new questions, situations the sources had not directly addressed, that required the working out of the law through reasoning. And the circle would have worked through these questions, reasoning from the sources, weighing the factors, considering the consequences, reaching well-reasoned conclusions through the collective thought of the master and his students. The circle was occupied with the working out of the law, the reasoning through of legal questions, the application of the principles of the faith to the questions of life. An appealing quality fills this picture of the circle of learning, this gathering of master and students engaged in the lively working out of the law. For it is a picture of the life of the mind at its best, of collective reasoning toward understanding, of the active engagement of minds in the working out of difficult questions. The circle of Abu Hanifa was such a place, a gathering of minds engaged in the lively reasoning out of the law, the collective pursuit of understanding through discussion and debate. It is an appealing picture of the life of the mind, of the collective pursuit of understanding, of minds engaged together in the working out of difficult questions. And it was in this circle, through this collective reasoning, that Abu Hanifa's greatest work was done, the development of his jurisprudence, the working out of the law that would become his lasting legacy. His jurisprudence was not the product of solitary thought, worked out in isolation, but the fruit of the collective reasoning of his circle, the working out of the law through the discussion and debate of master and students. The circle was the workshop of his jurisprudence, the place where his legal thought was developed through collective reasoning, where his methods were applied to countless questions, where the body of his legal thought was worked out. His greatest work was done in the circle, through the collective reasoning of master and students. Consider the value of this collective reasoning, this working out of understanding through discussion and debate, for it points to a truth about the life of the mind. For understanding is often best pursued not in solitary isolation, but in the company of others, through discussion and debate, through the engagement of minds with one another. The collective reasoning of Abu Hanifa's circle, the working out of the law through discussion and debate, reflects this truth, the value of pursuing understanding in the company of others, through the engagement of minds. His circle was a community of inquiry, a gathering of minds pursuing understanding together, and it reflects the value of such communities, such collective pursuit of understanding through discussion and debate. So picture Abu Hanifa in his circle of learning, presiding over the lively discussion and debate through which the law was worked out, the master amid his students, engaged in the collective pursuit of understanding. It is a picture of the life of the mind at its best, of the collective reasoning toward understanding, of minds engaged together in the working out of difficult questions. And it was here, in this circle, through this collective reasoning, that Abu Hanifa's greatest work was done, the development of the jurisprudence that would become his lasting legacy. The merchant who became the father of law did his greatest work in the circle of learning, amid his students, in the lively collective reasoning out of the law that was the workshop of his genius and the source of his enduring legacy. At the very center of Abu Hanifa's legal genius was his development of the methods of legal reasoning, the ways in which the law could be reasoned out, applied to new situations, extended to cases the sources had never directly addressed. For the sources of the law, the sacred texts and traditions, could not directly address every situation that life might present, every new question that might arise. And the task of the jurist was to reason from the sources to the cases they did not directly address, to extend the principles of the law to new situations, to work out the right ruling for questions the sources had not directly answered. This reasoning out of the law, this extension of its principles to new cases, was the great work of jurisprudence, and Abu Hanifa was its master. Among the methods of reasoning that Abu Hanifa developed and employed was the method of reasoning by analogy, the extension of a ruling from a case the sources addressed to a similar case they did not, on the basis of the similarity between them. If the sources gave a ruling for one case, and another case was similar in the relevant respects, then the ruling could be extended, by analogy, to the similar case. This reasoning by analogy was a powerful method for extending the law to new situations, reasoning from the cases the sources addressed to the similar cases they did not. And Abu Hanifa was a master of it, employing it with great skill to work out the law for the countless situations the sources did not directly address. Let us return and dwell more deeply on the great achievement of Abu Hanifa, his development of the discipline of legal reasoning, for it is for this, above all, that he is remembered, and it is worth understanding more fully what this achievement involved and why it was so significant. The fundamental challenge of jurisprudence, the discipline that Abu Hanifa mastered, was this. The sources of the law, the sacred texts and the traditions, gave guidance for many situations, but they could not directly address every situation that life might present. Life is endlessly various, presenting always new situations, new questions, new circumstances that the sources had not directly addressed, and the task of the jurist was to derive from the sources guidance for these situations they did not directly address, to extend the principles of the law to the new questions that life presented, to work out the right ruling for cases the sources had not directly answered. This task required reasoning, the use of the mind to derive from the sources guidance for the situations they did not directly address. The jurist had to understand the principles underlying the rulings of the sources, to grasp the reasons and purposes behind them, and to extend these principles, these reasons and purposes, to the new situations that required guidance. This was a work of reasoning, of careful thought, of the application of the mind to the derivation of the law, and it was this work, the reasoning out of the law, that Abu Hanifa brought to its highest development. Abu Hanifa's genius lay in his mastery of this reasoning, his sophisticated development of the methods by which the law could be derived and extended. He understood the principles underlying the rulings of the sources, grasped the reasons and purposes behind them, and developed the methods by which these principles could be extended to new situations with rigor and consistency. His reasoning was careful, rigorous, systematic, attentive to the principles and purposes of the law, and able to extend them to new situations with a consistency and refinement that had not been achieved before him. He brought to the reasoning out of the law a genius that made it a sophisticated and rigorous discipline, refined beyond what his predecessors had achieved. A distinctive feature of Abu Hanifa's reasoning was its systematic and consistent character, its attention to the logical coherence of the law as a whole. He was concerned not merely to work out individual rulings, but to ensure that the law was coherent and consistent, that its rulings fit together logically, that the principles applied in one case were applied consistently in others. This concern for systematic coherence, for the logical consistency of the law as a whole, was a distinctive feature of his reasoning, reflecting the systematic cast of his mind, his concern that the law be not merely a collection of individual rulings, but a coherent and consistent system. He brought to the law a systematic coherence, a logical consistency, that reflected the rigor of his reasoning. Sometimes, by the accounts, this concern for systematic coherence led Abu Hanifa to rulings that set aside established practices or considerations of convenience in favor of what his systematic reasoning required. He was willing to follow his reasoning to its conclusions, even when these conclusions departed from established practice or convenience, valuing the systematic coherence of the law over mere custom or convenience. This willingness to follow his reasoning, to value systematic coherence over established practice, reflected the rigor and the independence of his thought, his commitment to the careful working out of the law through reasoning, rather than the mere following of custom. His was a jurisprudence of reason, willing to follow its reasoning to its conclusions, valuing systematic coherence over mere custom or convenience. Yet Abu Hanifa's reasoning was not merely abstract or rigid, for he was also attentive to the practical consequences of the law, to the purposes it was meant to serve, to the avoidance of harsh or inappropriate results. As we have seen, he employed a method of juristic preference that allowed for the setting aside of a strict analogy when it would lead to a harsh or inappropriate result, in favor of a ruling that better served the purposes of the law. This reflects a balance in his reasoning, between the rigor of systematic logic and the attention to practical consequences and purposes, between the consistency of the system and the avoidance of harsh results. His reasoning was rigorous but not rigid, systematic but attentive to purposes and consequences, balancing the logic of the system with the practical service of the law's ends. This balance between rigor and flexibility, between systematic logic and attention to purposes, was a mark of the sophistication of Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence, its development beyond a crude or rigid application of rules toward a sophisticated reasoning attentive both to logical consistency and to practical purposes. He developed a jurisprudence that was both rigorous and flexible, both systematic and practical, both logically consistent and attentive to the purposes the law was meant to serve. This sophisticated balance reflected the genius of his reasoning, the refinement of the discipline he developed, the height to which he brought the reasoning out of the law. So we may understand Abu Hanifa's great achievement as the development of the discipline of legal reasoning to a new height of sophistication and refinement, a jurisprudence both rigorous and flexible, systematic and practical, attentive both to logical consistency and to practical purposes. He took the fundamental challenge of jurisprudence, the derivation of guidance from the sources for the situations they did not directly address, and brought to it a genius of reasoning that made jurisprudence a sophisticated and refined discipline, a careful and systematic reasoning out of the law. It is for this achievement, this development of the discipline of legal reasoning, that he is remembered as the father of jurisprudence, the great master of legal reasoning, whose methods would shape the law for more than 1,000 years. Abu Hanifa also employed a method that allowed for the setting aside of a strict analogy when it would lead to a harsh or inappropriate result, in favor of a ruling that better served the purposes of the law, a method of juristic preference. For sometimes a strict reasoning by analogy would lead to a result that was harsh, or that did not serve the purposes of the law well, and in such cases Abu Hanifa would prefer a ruling that better served the law's purposes, setting aside the strict analogy in favor of the better result. This method of juristic preference reflected his concern that the law should serve its purposes well, should not be applied with a rigid strictness that led to harsh or inappropriate results, but should be reasoned out with attention to its purposes and the good it was meant to serve. These methods of reasoning, the reasoning by analogy and the juristic preference, along with the careful attention to the sources and the consensus of the early community, made Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence a discipline of careful and flexible reasoning, attentive to the sources but able to extend them to new situations, rigorous in its logic but attentive to the purposes of the law. His was a jurisprudence of reason, of careful thought, of the working out of the law through disciplined reasoning, and it reached a level of sophistication and refinement beyond what had been achieved before him. He brought the discipline of legal reasoning to a new height, developing its methods, refining its logic, making it a sophisticated discipline of careful and flexible reasoning. It is for this development of the methods of legal reasoning that Abu Hanifa is remembered as the father of jurisprudence, the one who, more than any other, developed the discipline of reasoning out the law. He took the practical reasoning mind, the mind trained to weigh and consider and reason from case to case, and applied it to the law with a genius that made him the master of legal reasoning, the founder of a sophisticated discipline of jurisprudence. His methods of reasoning, his approach to the working out of the law, became the foundation of a great school of legal thought, the school that would bear his name and follow his methods across the centuries. For the legal thought of Abu Hanifa, developed in his circle and carried on by his students, became the foundation of a great school of law, one of the major schools of jurisprudence of his faith. His students compiled and developed his teachings, working out the implications of his methods, applying his reasoning to countless questions, building a comprehensive body of law on the foundation of his legal thought. And this school of law, founded on the legal thought of Abu Hanifa, became the oldest and most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith, followed, to this day, by a great portion of the believers across the world. The legal genius of the merchant who had turned to the law became the foundation of a great and enduring school of legal thought, his methods of reasoning shaping the law for more than 1,000 years. For all his greatness as a jurist, Abu Hanifa was also a man of deep piety and simple living, devout in his faith, scrupulous in his conduct, generous to those in need. The accounts relate that he was devoted to prayer, spending long hours of the night in devotion, and that his piety was as deep as his learning was great. Though he had been a successful merchant, and was a man of some means, he lived simply, gave much of his wealth in charity, and was careful to avoid anything unlawful or even doubtful, scrupulous in his conduct as he had been scrupulous in his trade. His greatness as a jurist was joined to a deep piety and a scrupulous conduct. The master of the law, a man of devotion and integrity. A crucial part of Abu Hanifa's legacy, and one of the reasons his influence endured so powerfully across the centuries, was the circle of remarkable students he trained, who carried on his teaching, developed his methods, and spread his school of law across the world. For the legacy of a teacher depends greatly on the students who carry it on. And Abu Hanifa was blessed with students of remarkable ability, who ensured that his teaching would endure and spread. We have noted that Abu Hanifa's teaching circle was one of the most renowned centers of legal learning in the Muslim world, drawing students from far and wide. These students learned the law in his circle, absorbing his methods, participating in the collective reasoning and debate through which the law was worked out, developing under his guidance into accomplished jurists themselves. And the most gifted of them became great scholars in their own right, who carried on his teaching, developed his methods, and spread his school of law across the world. Among the most important of these students was one who became, after Abu Hanifa, a great jurist and a high judge, rising to the highest judicial office under the rulers of his age. This student, having learned the law in Abu Hanifa's circle, became one of the great jurists of his age, and, unlike his teacher, accepted high judicial office, becoming the chief judge of the empire. From this position of influence, he was able to spread the teaching of his master, to apply the methods of Abu Hanifa's school in the administration of the law, to give his teacher's jurisprudence a wide influence in the legal life of the empire. The student who became a high judge spread his master's teaching through his influential position, giving Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence a wide application in the law of the empire. Another of his great students devoted himself to the compilation and writing down of Abu Hanifa's teaching, ensuring its preservation in written form. For Abu Hanifa himself, by the accounts, did not leave extensive written works. His teaching was given orally, in the discussions and debates of his circle, and it might have been lost had it not been written down by his students. This student undertook the great task of compiling and writing down the teaching of his master, recording the legal opinions, the methods, the reasoning of Abu Hanifa's circle, ensuring that this teaching was preserved in written form for the generations to come. The student who compiled his master's teaching ensured its preservation, recording and writing the oral teaching that might otherwise have been lost. Through the work of these students, the teaching of Abu Hanifa was preserved, developed and spread. They recorded his teaching in written form, ensuring its preservation. They developed his methods, working out their implications, applying his reasoning to countless questions, building a comprehensive body of law on the foundation of his thought. And they spread his school across the world, through their teaching, their writings, their influence in the legal life of the empire. The students carried on the legacy of their master, preserving, developing, and spreading the teaching that he had given them, ensuring that his jurisprudence would endure and flourish across the centuries. Something worth pondering lives in the way Abu Hanifa's legacy depended on his students, in the importance of the transmission of teaching from master to students. For the greatest teaching, if it is not carried on by students, may be lost with the teacher's death, and the teaching that endures is the teaching that is carried on, developed, and spread by able students. Abu Hanifa's teaching endured because he trained able students who carried it on, who preserved and developed and spread it, who ensured that it would not be lost but would flourish across the centuries. The transmission of his teaching from master to students was crucial to its endurance, the able students ensuring the survival and flourishing of their master's legacy. This points to the importance of teaching, of the training of students, in the endurance of any intellectual tradition. For an intellectual tradition endures not merely through the genius of its founders, but through the transmission of its teaching from generation to generation, through generation, through the training of students who carry on, develop, and spread the teaching they have received. Abu Hanifa was not only a great thinker but a great teacher, who trained able students, who transmitted his teaching to a generation that would carry it on. And it was through this transmission, this training of students, that his teaching endured, his school flourished, his influence spread across the centuries. The great thinker was also a great teacher, and it was through his teaching, his training of students, that his legacy endured. The crucial importance of Abu Hanifa's students stands clear in the endurance of his legacy, the way his teaching depended on the able students who carried it on. He trained a circle of remarkable students, who preserved his teaching in writing, developed his methods, and spread his school across the world. Through these students, his teaching endured and flourished, his jurisprudence spread across the centuries, his school of law became the most widely followed of his faith. The merchant who became the master of the law was also a great teacher, whose able students carried on his legacy, ensuring that his jurisprudence would endure and flourish, guiding the lives of hundreds of millions across the centuries. He was generous, too, by the accounts, particularly toward his students, ensuring that they had what they needed, helping them with their clothing and housing, caring for them as a father cares for his children. He was attentive to the needs of his community, visiting the sick, attending funerals, caring for those in need, fulfilling the responsibilities of a member of his community. His piety expressed itself not only in his devotion, but in his generosity and his care for others. The great jurist, a man of generosity and community responsibility, devoted to the welfare of his students and his community. Behind Abu Hanifa's greatness as a jurist lay a deep piety and devotion, a life of prayer and worship that grounded and animated his scholarship. And this dimension of his life deserves our reflection, for it reveals that his legal genius was joined to a profound spiritual life. We have noted that Abu Hanifa was a man of deep piety, devoted to prayer, scrupulous in his conduct, generous to those in need. Let us dwell on this piety, this devotion that lay behind his scholarship. By the accounts, he was devoted to prayer, spending long hours of the night in worship, giving the hours of darkness to his devotions while others slept. His nightly prayer was, by the accounts, intense and prolonged, a deep communion with God that filled his nights, an expression of a piety as deep as his learning was great. The great jurist was also a man of deep devotion, giving his nights to prayer, communing with God in the long hours of darkness. This devotion, this life of prayer, grounded and animated his scholarship, giving it its deeper meaning and purpose. For Abu Hanifa's study of the law was not a merely intellectual exercise, a dry academic pursuit, but a religious devotion, a seeking to understand and apply the will of God, an act of worship in its own way. His study of the law was grounded in his piety, animated by his devotion, undertaken as a religious duty and an act of worship, the seeking to understand and apply the guidance of God for the conduct of life. The scholarship was grounded in the piety, the study of the law animated by the devotion, the intellectual labor undertaken as a religious act. Something important lies in this union of scholarship and piety, of the intellectual labor of the law and the spiritual devotion of prayer. For Abu Hanifa's law was not separated from his faith, his scholarship not divorced from his devotion, but the two were united, the scholarship grounded in the piety, the intellectual labor animated by the spiritual devotion. He studied the law as an act of faith, sought to understand the will of God through his scholarship, undertook the intellectual labor of jurisprudence as a religious devotion. The union of scholarship and piety, of intellectual labor and spiritual devotion, was a mark of his life. The great jurist, a man of deep faith, his learning grounded in his devotion. And his piety expressed itself, too, in the scrupulousness of his conduct, the care he took to avoid anything unlawful or even doubtful. By the accounts, he was extraordinarily careful in his conduct, avoiding not only what was clearly unlawful, but even what was doubtful, staying away from anything about which there was any question, scrupulous to a remarkable degree about the rightness of his conduct. This scrupulousness, this care to avoid even the doubtful, reflected the depth of his piety, his concern to do right in all things, his desire to keep his conduct pure and free of any taint of wrongdoing. The scrupulousness he had shown as a merchant, his care about right dealing, was an expression of this deep piety, this concern to do right in all things. His piety expressed itself also in his generosity, his care for others, his fulfillment of his responsibilities to his community. By the accounts, he was generous with his wealth, giving much in charity, caring for his students, helping those in need. He was attentive to his community, visiting the sick, attending funerals, fulfilling the responsibilities of a member of his community. His piety was not merely a private devotion, but expressed itself in generosity and care for others, the fulfillment of his responsibilities to his community, the service of those in need. The piety that filled his nights with prayer expressed itself also in generosity and care for others, in the service of his community and those in need. Consider this union of scholarship, piety, and good conduct in Abu Hanifa's life, the way his learning, his devotion, and his ethical conduct were joined together in a single integrated life. He was not a scholar whose learning was divorced from his life, nor a devotee whose piety was separated from his conduct, but a man in whom learning, devotion, and ethical conduct were united, each grounding and expressing the others. His scholarship was grounded in his piety expressed in his conduct reflecting his learning and his devotion. The integration of learning, devotion, and conduct in a single life was a mark of his greatness. The great jurist, a man of deep piety and scrupulous conduct, his life an integrated whole of scholarship, devotion, and ethical action. So we may see behind Abu Hanifa's greatness as a jurist the deep piety and devotion that grounded and animated his scholarship, the life of prayer and worship, the scrupulous conduct, the generosity and care for others that joined with his learning in a single integrated life. His legal genius was not a merely intellectual achievement, divorced from faith and conduct, but was grounded in a deep piety, animated by a profound devotion, joined to a scrupulous and generous conduct. The merchant who became the master of the law was a man of deep faith and scrupulous conduct, his scholarship grounded in his devotion, his learning joined to his piety in a single integrated life devoted to the understanding and the service of God. But the integrity that marked Abu Hanifa's life would, in the end, bring him into conflict with the powerful, and this conflict would lead to his imprisonment and his death. For the rulers of his age, recognizing his great learning and his standing among the people, sought to bring him into the service of the state, to make him a judge, to give him high office in the administration of the law. To be a judge, a qadi, was a high and honorable office, the administration of justice on behalf of the state, and the rulers sought to appoint Abu Hanifa to this office, to bring his learning into the service of their government. But Abu Hanifa refused, again and again, declining the office that was pressed upon him, unwilling to enter the service of rulers he could not in conscience serve. By the accounts, he feared that as a judge in the service of the state, he might be pressured to give rulings that were not just, to bend the law to the will of the rulers, to compromise his integrity in the service of power. And rather than risk this, rather than enter a position in which his integrity might be compromised, he refused the office, declining to become a judge, preferring to remain an independent scholar, free to teach and to reason out the law according to his conscience, rather than an official of the state, bound to serve the will of the rulers. This refusal was an act of remarkable integrity and courage, for it set him against the powerful, who did not take kindly to the refusal of the office they pressed upon him. To refuse the office that the rulers offered, to decline to enter their service, was to defy their will, to set himself against their wishes, and this defiance angered the powerful, who would not tolerate the refusal of one they sought to bring into their service. Abu Hanifa's refusal of office, his unwillingness to compromise his independence, brought him into conflict with the rulers, who responded to his defiance with anger and, in the end, with imprisonment. For when Abu Hanifa persisted in his refusal, the ruler had him imprisoned, punishing his defiance with the loss of his freedom. By the accounts, he was imprisoned and subjected to hardship, even, by some accounts, to flogging, the punishment of the powerful for his refusal to enter their service. We will not dwell on the details of his suffering, for the simple fact is sorrowful enough. The great jurist, who had refused to compromise his integrity, was imprisoned and mistreated for his refusal, punished by the powerful for his unwillingness to bend to their will. He endured this imprisonment and hardship by the accounts, with patience and steadfastness, never abandoning his principles, never bending to the will of the rulers, faithful to the end to the integrity that had brought him to prison. A deeply admirable quality marks the patience and steadfastness with which Abu Hanifa endured his imprisonment, his faithfulness to his principles even in suffering. By the accounts, he bore his mistreatment with patience, did not grow angry at those who wronged him, even prayed for the forgiveness of those who had imprisoned and mistreated him. His steadfastness in suffering, his patience under mistreatment, his freedom from anger even toward those who wronged him, reflected the depth of his character, the genuineness of the integrity that had brought him to prison. He remained faithful to his principles, patient in his suffering, free of bitterness even toward his persecutors, to the very end. The refusal of office that defined the end of Abu Hanifa's life, his repeated declining of the high judicial position pressed upon him by the rulers, and the imprisonment it brought, deserves our deeper reflection, for it reveals the depth of his integrity and the meaning of the independence he so valued. We have noted that the rulers of his age sought to make Abu Hanifa a judge, to bring him into the service of the state, and that he refused, again and again, declining the office, unwilling to enter the service of rulers he could not in conscience serve. Let us consider more deeply why he refused, and what his refusal meant. To be a judge, a qadi, in the service of the state, was to administer justice on behalf of the rulers, to apply the law as an official of their government. This was a position of honor and influence, and many would have welcomed it. But it carried a danger, for the judge in the service of the state might be pressured to give rulings that served the interests of the rulers rather than the demands of justice, to bend the law to the will of the powerful, to compromise the integrity of his judgments in the service of those he served. The judge in the service of the state was not fully independent, but was bound, in some measure, to serve the will of the rulers, and this might require the compromise of his integrity, the bending of his judgments to the will of the powerful. It was this danger, by the accounts, that Abu Hanifa feared, and that led him to refuse the office. He feared that as a judge in the service of the state, he might be pressured to give unjust rulings, to bend the law to the will of the rulers, to compromise his integrity in the service of power. And rather than risk this compromise of his integrity, rather than enter a position in which he might be made the instrument of injustice, he refused the office, preferring to remain an independent scholar, free to teach and reason according to his conscience, rather than an official bound to serve the will of the rulers. His refusal was a refusal to compromise his integrity, to risk being made the instrument of injustice, to surrender his independence to the service of power. There is a deep principle in this refusal, the principle of the independence of the scholar, the integrity that will not be compromised in the service of power. Abu Hanifa valued his independence, his freedom to teach and reason according to his conscience, his integrity that would not bend to the will of the powerful, and he refused to surrender this independence, to compromise this integrity, even for the honor and influence of high office, even under the pressure of the rulers. His refusal expressed the principle of the independence of the scholar, the integrity that maintains its freedom and its principles, even against the power and the pressure of rulers. He would not be made the instrument of power, would not surrender his independence, would not compromise his integrity, whatever the cost. And the cost was great, for his refusal brought him imprisonment, and, in the end, death. The rulers, angered by his refusal, by his defiance of their will, punished him with imprisonment, with hardship, even, by some accounts, with flogging, and he died, by the accounts, in prison, or as a result of his imprisonment. He paid for his independence, his integrity, his refusal to compromise, with his freedom and his life. The cost of his refusal was imprisonment and death. The price he paid for maintaining his independence and his integrity against the power of the rulers. And he paid this price, accepted this cost, rather than surrender his independence or compromise his integrity, faithful to his principles even unto imprisonment and death. Something deeply admirable, even heroic, lives in this, in the willingness to pay so great a price for the sake of one's integrity and independence. Abu Hanifa might have accepted the office, taken the honor and influence it offered, avoided the imprisonment and death that his refusal brought. Instead, he chose to refuse, to maintain his independence and integrity, to accept imprisonment and death, rather than compromise his principles. His willingness to pay so great a price for his integrity, to accept imprisonment and death rather than compromise, reflects the depth of his commitment to his principles, the heroism of his integrity, the genuineness of his independence. He valued his integrity more than his freedom, more than his life, and he proved this by paying the ultimate price for it. Consider the meaning of this integrity, this independence, for which Abu Hanifa paid so dearly, for it speaks to the value of maintaining one's principles against the pressure of power. For there is often, in human affairs, a pressure to compromise one's principles, to bend to the will of the powerful, to surrender one's independence for the sake of advantage or safety. And there is a deep value in resisting this pressure, in maintaining one's integrity and independence, in holding to one's principles whatever the cost. Abu Hanifa's example embodies this value, the maintenance of integrity and independence against the pressure of power, the holding of one's principles whatever the cost, even unto imprisonment and death. His example calls us to value our own integrity and independence, to maintain our principles against the pressures that would have us compromise them. So we may see in Abu Hanifa's refusal of office, his maintenance of his independence and integrity against the power of the rulers, and the imprisonment and death it brought, a profound witness to the value of integrity and independence, the holding of one's principles whatever the cost. He refused to compromise his integrity, to surrender his independence, even for the honor of high office, even under the pressure of the rulers, even at the cost of imprisonment and death. His refusal embodied the principle of the independence of the scholar, the integrity that will not bend to power, and he proved the genuineness of this integrity by paying for it with his freedom and his life. The merchant who became the master of the law was also a man of heroic integrity, who held to his principles even unto death in prison, a witness across the centuries to the value of integrity and independence maintained against the power of the world. And so, by the accounts, around the year 767, Abu Hanifa died, while still imprisoned, at about 70 years of age. The accounts of the precise cause of his death vary, some holding that he died of the hardships of his imprisonment, others that he was poisoned, but all agree that he died in prison, or as a result of his imprisonment, faithful to the end to the principles for which he had been imprisoned. We will not invent the scene of his passing, nor adorn it with marvels, for the simple facts are dignified enough. The great jurist, who had refused to compromise his integrity, died in prison, or as a result of his imprisonment, faithful to the end to the independence he would not surrender. His death, by the accounts, was deeply mourned, and his funeral drew immense crowds, so many that the funeral prayer was performed many times over to accommodate the multitudes who came to honor him. The great jurist, imprisoned and mistreated by the powerful, was honored in death by the people, who came in immense numbers to his funeral, mourning the passing of the master of the law, the man of integrity who had refused to compromise his principles. The honor the people paid him in death testified to the reverence in which he was held. The love and respect of the people for the great jurist who had given his life to the law and his integrity. He was buried in the city where he died, and his resting place came to be honored in his memory, the place where the great jurist was laid to rest becoming a place of reverence and remembrance. We mention this gently and with respect, as the simple fact of how he has been remembered, for our story is of his life and his learning, rather than of the honors paid after his death. It is enough to know that the great jurist came at last to his rest, his devoted life complete, his integrity faithful to the end, even unto death in prison. But though his life ended in prison, his influence did not end, but spread and grew across the centuries, far beyond anything his beginnings in trade might have suggested. For the school of law that Abu Hanifa founded, carried on by his students and developed across the generations, became the oldest and most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith, followed, to this day, by a great portion of the believers across the world. His methods of legal reasoning, his approach to the working out of the law, shaped the legal thought of his faith for more than 1,000 years, influencing the development of jurisprudence, providing the foundation of a great legal tradition. The legal genius of the merchant who had turned to the law became one of the most influential intellectual achievements in the history of his civilization, his school of law guiding the lives of hundreds of millions across the centuries. The school of law that Abu Hanifa founded spread, across the centuries, to become the most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith, embraced by a great portion of the believers across the world. And the breadth and the endurance of this influence deserves our reflection, for it is one of the most remarkable intellectual legacies in the history of his civilization. After Abu Hanifa's death, his school of law, carried on by his students and developed across the generations, spread far beyond the city of Kufa, where it had begun. It spread in time across vast regions of the world, embraced by the believers of many lands, becoming the dominant school of law in great parts of the world of his faith. From its origins in Kufa, the school spread across the lands of the east and the north and beyond, embraced by the believers of many regions, becoming the most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith. The legal thought that had begun in the circle of a Kufan jurist spread across the world, guiding the lives of believers in many lands. The school spread, in particular, across the great regions to the east and north, the lands of Central Asia and the regions beyond, where it became the dominant school of law, embraced by the believers of those vast regions. It spread to the lands of the south and east, to the great populations of the eastern regions, where it became the prevailing school. It was embraced by great empires and dynasties, who adopted it as the school of law of their realms, giving it official standing and wide application. Across vast regions and great populations, the school of Abu Hanifa became the dominant school of law, embraced by the believers, adopted by the rulers, applied in the legal life of great realms. What accounts for this remarkable spread, this wide embrace of Abu Hanifa's school? Part of the answer lies in the qualities of the school itself, the qualities of Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence that made it well suited to wide application. His jurisprudence, with its sophisticated reasoning, its attention to the purposes of the law, its flexibility in addressing new situations, was well suited to the needs of diverse societies and changing circumstances. The flexibility of his method, its capacity to address new situations through reasoning, made his school adaptable to the varied needs of different societies and times, contributing to its widespread and embrace. The qualities of his jurisprudence, its sophisticated and flexible reasoning, made his school well suited to wide application across diverse societies. Part of the answer lies, too, in the able students and successors who carried on and spread the school, who developed its teaching, applied its methods, and gave it influence across the world. As we have seen, Abu Hanifa trained able students who carried on his teaching, and these students and their successors spread the school across the world through their teaching, their writings, their influence in the legal life of the empires. The transmission of the school through able successors, generation after generation, contributed to its spread and endurance. The school carried on and developed and spread by the scholars who followed in the tradition of Abu Hanifa. And part of the answer lies in the adoption of the school by great empires and dynasties, who gave it official standing and wide application in their realms. For when a great empire or dynasty adopted the school as the law of its realm, applied it in its courts, gave it official standing, the school gained a wide application and influence, embraced by the populations of the realm, applied in its legal life. The adoption of the school by great realms contributed greatly to its spread, the official standing and wide application giving it influence across vast regions and great populations. The school spread not only through teaching and transmission, but through its adoption by the great realms of the world of his faith. A remarkable quality marks the breadth and the endurance of this influence, flowing across more than 1,000 years from the circle of a single jurist in the city of Kufa. Abu Hanifa was one jurist, teaching in his circle in a single city, and yet the legal thought he developed there spread across the world, embraced by a great portion of the believers, applied in the legal life of great realms, enduring across more than 1,000 years. The influence of his thought, flowing from his circle in Kufa across the world and across the centuries, is one of the most remarkable intellectual legacies in the history of his civilization. The legal genius of a single jurist shaping the lives of hundreds of millions across more than 1,000 years. Here we recognize the remarkable breadth and endurance of Abu Hanifa's influence, the spread of his school across the world to become the most widely followed of the schools of law of his faith. From its origins in his circle in Kufa, the school spread across vast regions and great populations, embraced by the believers, adopted by the rulers, enduring across more than 1,000 years. The qualities of his jurisprudence, the able successors who carried it on, and the adoption of the school by great realms, all contributed to this remarkable spread, this wide and enduring influence. The legal genius of the merchant who became the master of the law became one of the most influential and enduring intellectual legacies in the history of his civilization, his school of law guiding the lives of a great portion of the believers across the world and across the centuries. And here we begin to see the deepest meaning of his life, the thing that makes it endure beyond all the particulars of his story. His life was, above all, a life of the disciplined and reasoning mind, devoted to the careful working out of the law, the patient reasoning toward what was right, the development of the methods by which the law could be reasoned out and applied to life. He gave his life to this, to the life of the mind, to the careful reasoning out of the law, and he developed this reasoning to a genius that made him the father of jurisprudence, the master of legal reasoning. His life was a witness to the power and the dignity of the reasoning mind, devoted to the careful working out of what is right. And his life was, too, a witness to integrity, to the holding of one's principles whatever the cost. For he refused to compromise his integrity, to bend his principles to the will of the powerful, even at the cost of his freedom, and, in the end, his life. He held to his principles, refused the office that would have compromised them, endured imprisonment and death rather than betray his integrity. His life was a witness to the holding of one's principles whatever the cost, the integrity that would not bend even before the power of rulers, even unto death in prison. There is a deep unity, worth dwelling on, between the two great phases of Abu Hanifa's life, his years as a merchant and his life as a jurist, a unity that helps us to understand the man and the distinctive character of his genius. For the merchant and the jurist were not two different men but one, and the qualities of the merchant carried over into and shaped the work of the jurist. We have noted that Abu Hanifa's years as a merchant developed in him a practical, reasoning mind, trained in the careful weighing and considering that commerce required. The merchant must reason carefully about his transactions, weigh and measure, consider every angle, anticipate consequences, reason from one case to another. This is a practical reasoning, concerned with concrete situations, attentive to consequences, skilled in the weighing of factors and the reasoning toward sound conclusions. And Abu Hanifa developed this practical reasoning through his years in trade, training his mind in the careful consideration that commerce required. And this practical reasoning carried over into his work as a jurist, shaping the distinctive character of his jurisprudence. For his jurisprudence was marked, as we have seen, by careful reasoning, by attention to concrete situations, by the weighing of factors, by the reasoning from one case to another, by attention to consequences and purposes. These are the qualities of the practical reasoning mind, the mind trained in the careful consideration of concrete matters, and they marked Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence, giving it its distinctive character. The practical reasoning of the merchant carried over into the jurisprudence of the scholar, shaping its careful attention to concrete situations, its weighing of factors, its reasoning from case to case, its attention to consequences and purposes. We can see this carryover, perhaps, in Abu Hanifa's method of reasoning by analogy, the extension of a ruling from one case to a similar case on the basis of their similarity. For this reasoning from case to case, this extension of a principle from one situation to a similar one, is akin to the reasoning of the merchant, who reasons from one transaction to another, who applies the lessons of one case to similar cases, who extends his judgment from familiar situations to new but similar ones. The reasoning by analogy that marked Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence has an affinity with the practical reasoning of the merchant, the reasoning from case to case, the extension of judgment from one situation to a similar one. The merchant's practical reasoning found expression in the jurist's reasoning by analogy. We can see it, too, in Abu Hanifa's attention to the consequences and purposes of the law, his concern that the law should serve its purposes well, should not lead to harsh or inappropriate results. For this attention to consequences and purposes is akin to the merchant's attention to the practical outcomes of his decisions, his concern that his transactions should serve their purposes well, should not lead to bad results. The merchant must attend to the practical consequences of his decisions, and this attention to consequences carried over into Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence, his concern that the law should serve its purposes well, his method of juristic preference that set aside a strict analogy when it would lead to a harsh result. The merchant's attention to consequences found expression in the jurist's attention to the purposes of the law, and we can see the carryover, above all, in the integrity that marked both the merchant and the jurist, the scrupulous concern for right that characterized both phases of his life. As a merchant, Abu Hanifa was scrupulously honest, careful about right dealing, unwilling to take unfair advantage. As a jurist, he was scrupulously concerned for justice, careful about the rightness of his rulings, unwilling to compromise his integrity. The same scrupulous concern for right marked both the merchant and the jurist, the integrity that characterized his trade carrying over into his scholarship, and his refusal of office. The merchant's integrity and the jurist's integrity were one and the same, the scrupulous concern for right that marked his whole life. This unity between the merchant and the jurist helps us to understand the distinctive character of Abu Hanifa's genius, its practical and reasoning cast, its attention to concrete situations and consequences, its scrupulous concern for right. His was not the genius of an abstract theorist, divorced from practical concerns, but the genius of a practical reasoner, trained in the concrete reasoning of trade, attentive to consequences and purposes, scrupulous about right. The practical reasoning mind of the merchant, carried over into the work of the jurist, gave Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence its distinctive character, its practical and reasoning cast, its attention to the concrete and the consequential, its scrupulous concern for right. So we may see the deep unity between the merchant and the jurist, the way the qualities of the merchant carried over into and shaped the work of the jurist, the practical reasoning, the attention to consequences, the scrupulous integrity that marked Abu Hanifa as a merchant carried over into his work as a jurist, shaping the distinctive character of his jurisprudence. The merchant and the jurist were one man, and the genius of the jurist was shaped by the qualities of the merchant, the practical reasoning mind of trade, finding its highest expression in the reasoning out of the law. The merchant who became the father of law brought the practical reasoning and the scrupulous integrity of the merchant to the work of the jurist, and in this union lay the distinctive character of his genius. There is a lesson in this that reaches across the centuries to each of us who hears it. It is the lesson of the disciplined mind devoted to understanding, and of the integrity that holds to its principles whatever the cost. Abu Hanifa gave his life to the careful reasoning out of what was right, and held to his principles even unto imprisonment and death. And his example calls us to the life of the mind, to the careful pursuit of understanding, and to the integrity that holds to its principles whatever the cost, that will not compromise what is right even before the power of those who would bend us to their will. As we draw toward the close of his story, let us reflect on what Abu Hanifa's life might mean for us, in our own very different age, for though few of us are jurists, his life speaks to all who value the life of the mind, the careful pursuit of understanding, and the integrity that holds to its principles. At the center of Abu Hanifa's life was the disciplined and reasoning mind, devoted to the careful working out of difficult questions, the patient reasoning toward what was right. He gave his life to the life of the mind, to the careful reasoning out of the law, to the patient working through of difficult questions, and he developed this reasoning to a genius that made him the father of jurisprudence. His life was, above all, a witness to the power and the dignity of the reasoning mind, devoted to the careful pursuit of understanding. This devotion to the life of the mind, to the careful pursuit of understanding, speaks to all who value thought and learning in any age. For the careful reasoning that Abu Hanifa embodied, the patient working out of difficult questions, the disciplined pursuit of understanding, is a value that transcends his particular discipline and his particular age. The life of the mind, the careful pursuit of understanding through disciplined reasoning, is a value for every age, and Abu Hanifa embodied it supremely, giving his life to the careful reasoning out of difficult questions, the patient pursuit of understanding. His example calls us to value the life of the mind, the careful pursuit of understanding, the disciplined reasoning toward what is true and right. We live, in our own age, in a time when careful reasoning is often in short supply, when difficult questions are often approached with haste rather than patience, with passion rather than reason, with the rush to judgment rather than the careful working out of understanding. Against this, Abu Hanifa's example stands as a reminder of the value of careful reasoning, of patient thought, of the disciplined working out of difficult questions. His example calls us, in our own age, to a greater care in our reasoning, a greater patience in our thought, a greater devotion to the careful pursuit of understanding, rather than the haste and the passion that so often substitute for genuine thought. And Abu Hanifa's life speaks to us, too, of integrity, of the holding of one's principles whatever the cost. For he held to his principles, refused to compromise his integrity, even at the cost of his freedom and his life. His integrity, his refusal to bend his principles to the will of the powerful, his willingness to pay the ultimate price rather than compromise, speaks to the value of integrity in every age. We live in a time, as every age has been, when there is pressure to compromise our principles, to bend to the will of the powerful, to surrender our integrity for the sake of advantage or safety. And against this, Abu Hanifa's example stands as a witness to the value of integrity, the holding of one's principles whatever the cost. We might learn from Abu Hanifa's example, then, both the devotion to the life of the mind and the integrity that holds to its principles. We might learn his careful reasoning, his patient pursuit of understanding, his disciplined working out of difficult questions. And we might learn his integrity, his refusal to compromise his principles, his willingness to maintain his independence and his integrity whatever the cost. These two values, the devotion to careful understanding and the integrity that holds to its principles, were joined in Abu Hanifa's life, and they speak together to us across the centuries, calling us to value both the careful pursuit of understanding and the integrity that will not compromise what is right. To contemplate this life of the disciplined mind and the steadfast integrity, as the night deepens, is itself a kind of inspiration, a turning of the mind toward the values that Abu Hanifa embodied, the careful pursuit of understanding and the integrity that holds to its principles. There is something elevating in the contemplation of such a life, devoted to the careful working out of what is right and faithful to its principles whatever the cost, that may inspire us toward a greater care in our own thinking and a greater steadfastness in our own integrity. Abu Hanifa embodied these values supremely, and his example calls us toward them, the careful pursuit of understanding and the steadfast integrity that he embodied in his life and his death. So as the night settles around you, and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of Abu Hanifa's spirit, his devotion to careful understanding and his steadfast integrity, not as a burden, but as a quiet inspiration, a glimpse of the value of the disciplined mind and the steadfast integrity. The merchant who became the father of law, who reasoned out the law with a genius unmatched in his age, who held to his principles even unto death in prison, has finished his long and devoted journey. And his example remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to value the careful pursuit of understanding and the integrity that holds to its principles, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. There is an aspect of Abu Hanifa's jurisprudence that deserves particular reflection, for it lay at the very center of his approach and has been the subject of much discussion across the centuries. The relationship, in his thought, between reason and the sources, between the use of the reasoning mind and the authority of the sacred texts and traditions. Abu Hanifa is remembered, above all, for his emphasis on reason, his confidence in the use of the mind to work out the law, his development of the methods of legal reasoning. This emphasis on reason was a distinctive feature of his jurisprudence, marking it as a jurisprudence of careful thought, of the working out of the law through reasoning, of the confident use of the mind to derive and extend the law. He was, in this sense, a champion of reason in the law, one who trusted the reasoning mind to work out the law, to extend its principles, to derive guidance for the situations the sources did not directly address. But we should be careful not to misunderstand this emphasis on reason as though it meant a disregard for the sources, a reliance on reason alone apart from the sacred texts and traditions. For Abu Hanifa did not disregard the sources. On the contrary, he held them in the highest regard, regarding the sacred texts and the established traditions as the foundation of the law, the authoritative sources from which the law must be derived. His use of reason was not a substitute for the sources but a means of deriving from them, of understanding their principles and extending them to new situations. Reason served the sources, in his approach, deriving from them, extending them, applying them, rather than replacing them. The relationship between reason and the sources, in Abu Hanifa's thought, was thus a relationship of service, in which reason served the derivation and application of the law from its authoritative sources. The sources were the foundation, the authoritative basis of the law. Reason was the means by which the law was derived from this foundation and extended to the situations the sources did not directly address. Reason did not stand above the sources, nor replace them, but serve them, deriving from them the guidance they contained and extending their principles to new situations. The balance between reason and the sources. The service of reason to the derivation of the law from its authoritative foundation was a mark of Abu Hanifa's approach. This balance is worth dwelling on, for it reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between reason and authority in the law. For there is a danger, on the one hand, of relying on reason alone, apart from the sources, working out the law by reason without regard for its authoritative foundations. And there is a danger, on the other hand, of a rigid literalism, clinging to the letter of the sources without the reasoning needed to understand their principles and apply them to new situations. Abu Hanifa avoided both dangers, holding to the sources as the authoritative foundation while using reason to derive from them and extend them, balancing the authority of the sources with the necessary work of reasoning. His was a balanced approach, avoiding both the excess of reason apart from the sources and the rigidity of literalism without reasoning. We should note that Abu Hanifa's emphasis on reason was sometimes the subject of criticism, both in his own age and later, from those who favored a greater reliance on the literal transmission of the traditions and a lesser role for reasoning. Some held that he relied too much on reason, too little on the transmitted traditions, and this criticism was made by those who favored a more literal and tradition-bound approach to the law. We need not enter into these debates, which are complex and have been discussed across the centuries. It is enough to note that Abu Hanifa's emphasis on reason, his confidence in the use of the mind to work out the law, was a distinctive feature of his approach, valued by many as a strength, criticized by some as an excess, but in any case a defining characteristic of his jurisprudence. What is clear is that Abu Hanifa's approach, his balance of reason and the sources, his confidence in the use of the mind to derive and extend the law, gave his jurisprudence a particular character, a flexibility and a capacity to address new situations that contributed to its wide influence and enduring appeal. For his jurisprudence, with its developed methods of reasoning, its capacity to derive guidance for new situations, its attention to the purposes of the law, was well suited to address the changing circumstances and new questions of different times and places. The flexibility and the reasoning capacity of his approach, the balance of reason and the sources, contributed to the wide influence and enduring appeal of his jurisprudence, its capacity to guide the believers across diverse circumstances and changing times. So we should understand Abu Hanifa's emphasis on reason rightly, not as a disregard for the sources, but as a confident use of the reasoning mind to derive from and extend the authoritative sources of the law, a balance of reason and authority that gave his jurisprudence its distinctive character and enduring appeal. He held the sources in the highest regard, as the authoritative foundation of the law, and he used reason to derive from them and extend them, balancing the authority of the sources with the necessary work of reasoning. This balance, this confident use of reason in the service of the sources, was a mark of his genius, the foundation of the flexible and reasoning jurisprudence that became one of the great legal traditions of his faith, guiding the believers across diverse circumstances and changing times. Let us pause, before we let his story rest, to hold in our minds the central image of his life, the image that gathers up its meaning. A man seated amid a circle of students in the great city of Kufa, reasoning out the law through patient thought and lively debate, his mind, trained in the careful reasoning of trade, turned now to the working out of right action, the careful derivation of the law. There is in this image something that speaks to the deepest part of us, the recognition of the mind at work, reasoning carefully toward understanding, devoted to the patient working out of what is right. For we know, in our own way, the satisfaction of the mind at work, the pleasure of reasoning carefully toward an answer, the quiet joy of understanding reached through patient thought. And in Abu Hanifa we see this satisfaction raised to its highest pitch, a life given to the careful reasoning out of the law, the patient working through of difficult questions, the disciplined pursuit of understanding. He shows us what the life of the mind can be, the heights to which careful reasoning can rise, the genius that patient thought can attain. And he shows us, too, that this life of the mind can be joined to a deep integrity, a steadfast holding to one's principles, a refusal to compromise what is right. He shows us, also, that the careful reasoning of ordinary life, the practical thought of trade and daily affairs, can rise to the highest intellectual achievement. For Abu Hanifa's genius grew from the practical reasoning of the merchant, the careful thought of ordinary commerce, raised and refined into the mastery of legal reasoning. His example shows that the careful thought of ordinary life can rise to the highest achievement, that the practical reasoning of daily affairs can be the foundation of intellectual genius, that the disciplined mind, whatever its beginnings, can attain the heights of understanding. So as the night deepens and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of his spirit, his devotion to careful understanding, his steadfast integrity, his patient reasoning toward what is right, not as a burden, but as a quiet inspiration, a glimpse of the dignity of the reasoning mind and the steadfast integrity that he embodied. The merchant who became the father of law, who reasoned out the law with a genius unmatched in his age, who held to his principles even unto death in prison, has finished his long and devoted journey. And his example remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to value the careful pursuit of understanding, and the integrity that holds to its principles, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. And here we return, at the last, to the quiet question his life poses to each of us who hears it. He gave his life to the careful reasoning out of what was right, and held to his principles whatever the cost. His life asks us, gently, about our own devotion to understanding and our own integrity, about whether we pursue understanding with care and patience, about whether we hold to our principles even when it is costly, even when the powerful would bend us to their will. It is a searching question, and a valuable one, and his life poses it with all the power of his devotion to the law and his integrity unto death. There is no need to answer that question tonight. Some questions are not meant to be solved quickly, but to be carried gently, turned over slowly, lived with over a long while. Let it rest beside you now softly, asking nothing of you, but a moment's quiet reflection. The merchant who became the father of law, who reasoned out the law with a genius unmatched in his age, who held to his principles even unto death in prison, has finished his own long and devoted journey, and you have followed it, gently, all the way to its peaceful end. So let your thoughts grow still. Let the city of Kufa fade into the dark, with its bustling markets and its circles of learning, and the merchant who became the master of the law, reasoning out the law in his circle, faithful to his principles unto death. Let the names and the details drift away, for they have done their work. What remains is only the quiet and the question, and the calm of the gathering night. May your mind grow easy, may your heart be untroubled, and may your rest tonight be deep and peaceful and kind.